right, everybody, it looks like we're up and running and ready to roll. I'm Dana Crawford. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here with Diana Petrillo. She is also known as the Adirondack Girl at Heart, and she's the author of 2 books and a busy blogger at adirondackgirlatheart.com. You've got to check out her blog, and that's how I found her, because I'm a subscriber of her blog and I enjoy reading her content very much. She loves sharing her knowledge and experience with other vintage lovers and sellers. She's from upstate New York, right near the Adirondack Mountains. So thanks so much for joining us, Diana. We really appreciate this.
Thanks, Dana. Happy to be here. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm so thankful and grateful to Dana and WorthPoint for having me speak with you today. If you're here, I'm assuming it's because you want to learn how to start selling in an antique booth and make money. So when I talk with people about getting started with an antique booth, the first question I ask is, are you an antique lover? And that might seem like an obvious question, but it really is something you should consider, because selling antiques and selling in a booth is not an easy business or an easy side business. You really want to genuinely love and appreciate vintage and antiques, because you're going to spend a lot of time shopping for each and every item. It's not like other retail where you get to buy 10 or 100 of, you know, a certain widget A and then 10 or 100 of widget B. You actually have to shop for each and every item. So you want to be sure that antiques, vintage and antiques, is something that you really enjoy and you really love. So that's the first question that I asked. I got into antiques kind of, it's in my DNA, I guess I would say, because both of my parents loved vintage and antiques and decorated our house with them and shopped for them. My father was a shop teacher, so he refinished lots of antique furniture. So, like I said, it's in my DNA. My father and I also dug for bottles. We look for old foundations for farmhouses and try to discover where they might have thrown away their garbage, and then go dig for bottles and other kinds of treasures. One of my favorite pastimes growing up. And then later in my life, one of my best friends was an antique dealer, and she suggested that I get into the business, especially when I started to have a family, because it was something that you can do as little or as much as you want. And it was a great side business for me for years while I was raising my kids. It gave me something that was my very own, that didn't have anything to do with them. And in some respects, it kind of saved my life. So I've been selling for over 20 years. I've been in an antique booth for over 20 years. And I also sell online. But I love selling in an antique booth because I like to style. I like to talk with other dealers, and I like to meet customers. And you can do that in person when you have an antique booth. So that's a little bit of my background. Now let's jump into how to get started selling in an antique booth. You're going to want to do some research before you get started. You're going to want to look at the antique malls or the antique centers that are in your area. And what you see here is a picture of my antique center. It's called the Gristmill Antique Center. It's in Troy, New York, which is in upstate New York, where I live. So while you're doing your research, you're going to want to take note of a few things. For example, how far away is the antique center from your home? So in my area, there aren't a lot of antique malls, and I have to actually drive 30 minutes to get to the Gristmill, which is a little longer than I would like, but not terrible. So you need to take note of that. How far away are the centers? What are their days and their hours? Some antique malls are open 7 days a week from 10 until 8 o'clock. Others, like mine, have more limited hours. Mine used to be open 7 days a week, but since the virus, they've moved to 4 days a week. And as a result, have lowered our rent, which was super, super nice of them. So depending on what it is that you're expecting, you're going to want to know what the days and hours of operation are, and do they fit into your schedule as far as when you're going to be able to bring new merchandise into the shop and that sort of thing. You want to notice what kinds of antiques are being sold at the center. So if you specialize in a certain area, like mid-century modern, and the antique mall that you're considering sells only primitives, that's probably not the right match for you, right? So you want to notice what's being sold. Some smaller malls may have a general focus where all the dealers are selling a certain style, but larger centers will usually have represented a variety of different styles, and in which case you're probably going to fit in no matter what your style is, right? And then you're going to want to notice, is there a mix of new in with the old? So my antique center is almost exclusively all vintage and antiques. So if I was a dealer that had a lot of hand painted signs, or I like to sell accessories like candles and soaps and things like that, it wouldn't really fit in my antique center. But there are a number of other centers around the country that allow antique booth dealers to sell both new and old. So you have to know what it is that you want to sell, and does the antique center that you're looking at accommodate that? So those are some of the questions that you want to get answers to when you're looking at the antique malls in your area. Now, before you talk to the owner of the shop about possibly renting there, you want to have answers to a few questions that they might have for you. So have in mind what type of antiques it is that you plan on selling, because the owner is going to ask you that. What type of antiques do you sell? And you want to have an answer for them. Would you be willing to sign a lease? Now, a lot of antique centers do not have leases. They are renting you space on a month-to-month basis. That means that you are expected to give them a month's notice if you decide to move out, and you're only paying monthly. You're only obligated to stay there for a month at a time. But there are places that do have leases. Sometimes they're 6 months, sometimes they're 12 months. Know the answer to that question going in. And then the last question you want to know the answer is, are you willing to work in the center? Some antique malls require their dealers to work a certain number of hours or a certain number of days a month. It's how they man their shop. My shop doesn't require any hours at all, and that works out perfectly for me because I don't really have time to work in the mall. So those are 3 questions that you just want to have the answers in your mind going in as you get ready to talk with the owner about the questions that you have about his mall. So the picture that you see here is of me and my shop owner, Bob, who is a fantastic guy, great guy to rent from. And so some of the questions that you're going to want to ask the owner are, how much is the rent? Obviously. Ask, do you have to sign the lease? Do you have to work there? You want to know if they charge a commission. You want to know if they're going to charge for credit card purchases, charge you for credit card purchases. If you want to sell handmade items, ask if that's allowed. Do you want to sell wholesale items like the soaps and candles, or vintage and antique style items that aren't true vintage or antiques? If you want to sell those things, ask if that's allowed. You also should ask what sells best in the shop, what items sell best, or what style sells best. They might have a very long answer for you, or they might just say everything, but You want to get as much information as you can up front, right? And then I would ask them, how's business? Now, any owner is going to be likely to say business is great or business is good, whether it's good or not, right? Because they want you, if they have space and you sell things that they're interested in, then they want you to come in, and they're going to probably be as positive as they possibly can on that question, but it's still worth asking. Okay. So after you talk to the owner, it would be great if you could get the opportunity to speak with one or more dealers who are selling in that shop to get their take on what it's like to be there. So some of the questions that you might want to ask them would be, how is business? And they are going to be much more likely to give you an honest answer probably than the owner. So how is business in that mall or in that antique center? How is traffic? Are sales good? Questions like that. You might want to ask them how long they've been in the center, because if they've been there for 10 or 15 years, then you can probably guess that that sales are good for them, right? Otherwise, why would they stay in the mall? I would ask questions about the owner, about their character, or about their personality. Are they enjoyable to deal with? Do customers like the owner? Are they friendly? Are they helpful? Those are questions that the answers are good to know before you go into the booth. And a final question that you might want to ask is, how often has the rent been raised? So in my case, I've been in this shop for a little over 4 years, and the rent has never been raised. And then with the COVID pandemic, our rent has actually been lowered, which, as I said, is super nice. But that sort of information is what you would like to know going into your antique booth experience. Okay, now before you make the decision or pick your antique mall, it makes sense to spend a little bit of time learning the laws in your state that relate to business or relate to small businesses. So you're going to want to learn business and sales and income tax laws. You don't have to become an expert. You just want to have a general idea of what is expected of you. Do you need to register your business? In New York State, you do not have to register it, but you can, and it's called a DBA, or doing business as. Do you need a sales ID number, a sales tax ID number? I believe most states require that. New York State requires that. Even though the antique mall owner collects sales tax for you and remits it to the state, you still need a sales tax ID number in New York State. And then you want to be sure that you know and understand the income tax laws, federal and state, related to deductions that you can take. You can take deductions for things like mileage and for supplies that you use in your business and that sort of thing. You want to know that going in so that you can keep really good records and pay less income tax, right? So those are some of the laws that you want to learn about before you jump into getting an antique booth. Now you've done your due diligence, you've researched the local antique malls, you've asked your questions, you understand the laws. What can you expect as far as rent or fees go related to an antique booth? So you expect rent, and generally that's going to be $2 to $3 per square foot. So if you're looking at an antique booth, a spot that's 10 feet by 10 feet, then you will expect to pay $200 to $300 in rent. Some antique malls also charge commission. Usually that's 5 to 10% of your sales for that particular month. So if you sell $100 that month, you're going to pay the shop an additional $10. The shop that I'm in right now does not have a commission, which is wonderful. I've been in other shops that do charge commission, one shop was started out at 5% and then they raised it to 10, which is can be a hardship for some people. Now, my shop did recently start charging me credit card fees. So if a buyer pays for one of my items with a credit card, I get charged the credit card fee, which is usually 3.5%. You want to know that going in, of course. You want to ask the owner that question. Okay? So that's what's to expect regarding rent and fees. Now, what should your profit goals be? This is a good idea to have in your mind as you go into the business or even before you make the decision. I have a couple of guidelines that I use. And so the first is I want to make 4 times the amount that I spend on any specific item. So if I buy something for $10, I want to be fairly certain that I can sell it for $40. So I'm 4 timesing my initial cost. So that's what I keep in mind while I'm buying. And 4 times is a minimum for me. I actually would like to make much more than that, up to 10 times. I'd like to 10 times my money. Now, if you're talking about really large ticket items, like if you see something that's $100, I don't need to 10 times $100, but 4 times would be excellent, right? And then the other thing that I like to keep in mind, and my girlfriend who got me into the business taught me this, and that is I want to 3 times my rent in my monthly sales. So if my rent is $200, I want to gross $600 for that month. I want to 3 times my rent each month. And so that means if I make 600 and then I pay 200 in rent, that brings me down to 400. And then the cost of goods, if I stick to 4 times, is going to be $150. Then that leaves me with $250 profit, which is not a lot of money in the scheme of things, but in the antique business, it's enough money to go out and buy more antiques. So those are the 2 things that I keep in mind: 4 times my cost and 3 times my rent. Okay, let's get into what kinds of merchandise you're going to want to be buying for your booth. So my first recommendation, my most important recommendation, is that you pick a style. Okay, I ask antique dealers, what's your style? Or what kind of antiques do you sell? And oftentimes they say, oh, I'm eclectic. My style is eclectic. Eclectic is not a style. It's a word to describe actually not having a style. And there's been so much market research done on niching down your business, whether it's an antique booth or a store or online. The more narrow your focus, the more attractive your booth is going to be, and the more sales I believe you're going to make. So my style tends to be farmhouse. It's a very popular style right now with decorators. I like it personally, and so that's the style that I try to stick to in my antique booth. And it can be really hard for antique lovers to do that because they like to buy everything, or they like everything that they see. But you're really going to benefit your sales if you can niche down and pick a style. So some of the styles that you might want to think about, first of all, what do you like? I would pick something that you personally like. So if you hate mid-century modern, don't pick it. But mid-century modern is a style. Industrial is a style. A lot of men go with that kind of look. You can have a 1970s style in your booth. You can go girly. I don't know if girly has a name or not, but if you love china and glassware and pretty things, your booth can be along those lines. Shabby chic is another style that you could think about for yourself. But what do you like? What do you find yourself buying for yourself? What kinds of vintage and antiques sell best from your antique mall? We already talked about that, right? If your mall, most of the dealers are selling farmhouse, well, then you probably better stick to that style. Do you have a certain color scheme that you enjoy? So farmhouse style, often dealers who specialize in that, their booth is very monochromatic, antique white with some brown and some taupe and maybe a little bit of black. But niching down is absolutely something that I recommend for your selecting your booth style. Okay, it's also easier on the brain for the buyer. Their mind is things are flow naturally when they're representing one style as opposed to a 1970s piece next to a primitive piece. Your brain and your eyes kind of have difficulty handling that, right? The other thing, when you niche down and you have a certain style, not only is your booth more attractive, but you are going to have repeat sellers. They are going to know, oh, Diana has farmhouse style. That's what I like, or that's what I want, or I'm looking for a gift for someone who likes that style. So there's a lot of reasons why niching down is important. Okay, let's talk about how to style your booth. So you've selected your style. Now, what are the principles that you can apply to make your booth really stand out, really be attractive and pull those buyers in, right? So the first is balance. And by balance, I mean the percentage of large, medium, and small items that you have in your booth. Believe it or not, this really makes the difference. So I have a really simple formula for you to remember. That is, you want to have 25% of the items in your booth large. That means your large pieces like shelving and dressers and corner cupboards and farm tables, things like that. 25% large, 25% medium, so vintage luggage, mirrors, large vases, lamps, that sort of thing. And then 50% small. So you've got 25% large, 25% medium, and 50% small. If you have too many smalls, more than 50%, your space is going to look cluttered. If you have too few smalls, your space is going to look empty. So this formula is one that generally works for most booths, and it's easy to keep in mind. So balance is the first point that you want to keep in mind. The first principle is balance. And the second is creating a focal point. Your focal point should be the first area of your booth that the buyer encounters. Usually that's going to be a back wall. For me, it's a back wall. So the picture you see here is the back wall of my antique booth where I've set up a apple green antique door. And then in front of that, I've placed a medium-sized commode and then put medium-sized pieces on top of it and attached to the door as well. You want your focal point. You want to spend time on your focal point, making it look really great. It should be the wow factor of your booth so that people see it and they're like, wow, I love those things. I want to see more of those things. And so they come into your booth and they do some shopping. So you want to have a focal point. You want a balance, you want a focal point, and then the last principle is build your space up. You want to use all of the real estate in your booth, right? You don't want to just use the floor and the outer edges of your booth. You want to build things up, and you need as many things at eye level as possible, because that's how people shop. They don't shop looking down at the floor, and they don't shop looking up in the air. They shop at eye level. So you want to get as many things up as possible. So here you see I have an enamel top farm table with a small dresser on top of it, and then some mediums and some smalls on top of it. So I've built up. Below that, you see a farmhouse stool with a crate on top of it. Building up again, right? And then next to that, a firkin with, looks like, oh, that's an enamel basin sitting on top of it, okay? So you want to build up. You want balance, you want a focal point, and you want to build up. Those are the three main principles of creating a booth that is really attractive to buyers. So focal point, building upward. Okay, so the last question, the last thing that you want to think about is how much merchandise you have going into your booth. So my recommendation is that you, before you rent your space, you have a lot of merchandise or enough merchandise to pretty much fill it up. Why pay for a booth when you don't have products or merchandise to go into it? In other words, you have to pay your month's rent up front. You don't want to rent empty space. You want your space to be full as quickly as possible. So what does that mean? You're going to want several large pieces of furniture, which you're going to use to display your mediums and your smalls, right? So you're going to want a farm table and a corner cupboard and maybe some crates. Those are on the smaller side to build things up, shelving units, things like that. Several pieces of furniture. And then you're going to want 3 or 4 banana boxes. That's what antique dealers often use to carry their merchandise or buy their merchandise. You're going to want 3 or 4 banana boxes filled with medium-sized items to go into your booth, and then 5 or 6 banana boxes filled with smalls. Okay, so that's just a general notion of how much merchandise you need to fill up a 10 by 10 antique booth. And I think that's my last bit of information for you. I hope you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on how to set up an antique booth and make money. Make money quickly. Make money starting out right from the very beginning. I hope you'll take advantage of my blog, AdirondackGirlAtHeart.com, that is filled with lots of really good and relevant information about how to sell vintage and antiques. Thanks for joining me here today. It's time to have fun and make money now that you know how to do it. And thanks so much, Dana and WorthPoint, for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. That was really, really good.
Thank you, Dana.
Okay. I just got a lot out of that. Okay, well, we have a question.
Oh, great.
And from Marianne, and she says, how often do you rotate your stock?
Oh, that's a great question. The principle that I apply is that I don't want anything in my antique booth for longer than a year. So at about 6 months, I will start marking down merchandise. And if it hasn't sold by the end of a year, then I will take it out. Now, as far as adding new merchandise, I recommend going weekly if you can to add merchandise and to pull a few things out that aren't selling. At least once every 2 weeks, go in and bring new merchandise. You want to fluff your booth. I also recommend changing out one area every time you go up. So that means, like, I might change my focal point monthly. Or if I have a big shelving unit, I will totally revamp it and fill it with merchandise from someplace else in my booth so that it looks different. Because there are people who shop at antique malls regularly. They'll go every week, every Saturday, or every Sunday, or once a month. And you want your space to look like it has new, fresh merchandise. And it should. It should have some new, fresh merchandise every couple of weeks, at a minimum every week if possible. And then, like I said, If it hasn't sold in a year, it's out. It's out of the booth. If it's something really special, something really, really valuable, then set it aside. Hang on to it. If it's not really that exciting and not really that valuable, then give it away or give it to Salvation Army or Goodwill and take a deduction for it.
Good tip. Good tip. Dina. Hi, Dina. She's from Connecticut, not too far from you.
No, hi, Dina.
I've gone treasure hunting with her at Brimfield.
Oh, fun.
She said, what about security?
Most antique centers that are very professional have cameras placed around the center, so that can be very helpful. I have a locked case in my booth, and I sell jewelry and small valuables from that case. It's actually a china cabinet, and the key for it is kept at the desk. So in order for anybody to see what's in there, they have to go to the desk, which isn't that far away. And then who's ever managing the shop that day gets the key and actually opens the cabinet and stays there while they look at whatever they're interested in, and then locks it when they're done.
Okay, that makes total sense. That's a good tip on the cabinet. So you can bring, your own cabinet in and have that. I like that. Very good.
It's not. Most people are honest, right? It's the rare person that is not. I think having the cameras up, and often larger antique centers have extra staff. So my shop is on the smaller side, so there's only 1 or 2 people there at a time. But I've been in other shops that were larger, and they have kind of roving dealers walking through the center at all times, and that cuts down on theft, I'm sure. So that actually is a good question. If you're concerned about that, do they have cameras? Do they have staff who are constantly roaming the shop, keeping an eye on things? Those are good questions. Thanks, Dina.
Marianne asked, do you ever sell on eBay?
Yes, I sell on eBay. I sell on Etsy. I sell on Facebook Marketplace, and I sell on my blog. So I have a lot of platforms that I sell from.
That's great.
But Diana is the eBay expert.
Well, but you have some great educational material on your website. So someone said, how do you determine which items should be sold in the antique store or on eBay for those of us who wish to sell in both venues? That was from Scott.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not one that can really be answered quickly. It's like a lot of the vintage and antique business. You kind of have to test. There are educational materials out there, though, that give you an idea of the sorts of things to sell. I actually have a book called or What to Sell on eBay, and I go into 10 categories of items that for me sell well there. There are some overlaps, of course, some things that you could sell either place, but like I sell a lot of cameras on eBay. I sell newer cameras on eBay that are really valuable that wouldn't fit into my antique booth. I sell for a long time, I sold a lot of perfume on eBay. Again, perfume doesn't really fit in with my farmhouse style of my antique booth. So that's one of the questions. Like, I will sell things on eBay or Etsy that don't fit into my style of my antique booth. After you sell in both venues or however many you have for a while, you start to get a feeling for what sells where. Am I right, Dana?
Yeah.
Is that something that you're kind of figuring out now yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And And that's why research is so important. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Diana. It was just such an honor to for you to present with us, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Dana.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.